Greetings everyone, this is Rambling Collector here, and we are back with another book review for all of you today. For the subject of this video, we are going to be diving back into the world of vampires with a series that some of you may know, some of you may not know. But for the subject of this video, we are going to be discussing the first omnibus of the series Vampirehunterd D by Hideyuki Kikuchi. And to be quite honest, Vampirehunterd D was something I had never heard of until picking up this novel. I'd heard it in Pass and Tale. People were recommending vampire anime and such. They would always bring up the name Vampirehunterd D, but I had no idea what it was. After reading this collection, I now finally understand the hype around it. But to give some context here, I've had this particular omnibus in my collection for a while now. However, it had just sat there gathering dust until recently, in January of this year, I finally started this. I was not aware that it was the first 3 books, though, or at the very least how long it would take me. As in, I've just now finished this collection, literally in the middle of March, God help me. But, you know what? It was a struggle, but it was a struggle I definitely enjoyed. But, with all that being said, let's go ahead and talk about it. So firstly, I want to say that Vampirehunterd D, as a story, it provides a very unique story with a dark setting. A world that is both highly evolved and yet teetering on the edge of the Dark Ages, with vampires and monsters running rampant. Now, to give some context about this world, this setting does not take place in any of the ancient past like it would with, say, Dracula or Carmilla, and it does not take place in modern day like it would with Twilight or anything like Empire the Vampire. No. This one takes place in the very far distant future, in the year 12,090 AD, meaning it is long past our time, ladies and gentlemen. But in that time period, humanity has greatly evolved, destroyed itself in a nuclear holocaust, utterly blasting the planet Earth into a wasteland, been saved by the nobility, aka vampires, brought back up to prosperity, rebelled against the vampiric nobles, who had subjugated humanity for centuries, and now they are teetering back into this post-apocalyptic setting where you have highly evolved guns and lifts and cars, but also the usage of carriages, or horses, aka robotic horses, but still horses. It's a huge hot pot of technology meeting old world tech, or old world weapons like wooden needles or swords of all shapes and sizes. It's fascinating to see this whole mix of science fiction and fantasy elements all rolled into one, with a good little bits of horror here and there. But we are actually focused on the main character here, and the main exploits of said character, the vampire hunter known only as D. And D himself is a fascinating character. This Dhampir, son of Dracula, is hunting down the vampiric nobles while being ostracized by humanity, and thus it makes him an enigma to both us as the reader, as well as the characters he interacts with throughout the series. Everyone describes him as ethereally beautiful. He looks like a simple young man who is too gorgeous for words, kind of like Alucard from Castlevania, but in this one it has an ethereal majesty to it. Now Dracula himself is actually portrayed as what most nobles call him as the sacred ancestor. And whenever Dracula's name is brought up, there is a sense of wonder, awe, as well as fear placed amongst it, but also sheer admiration by the many vampires who know of him, but have not met him in hundreds of years. But D has to contest with the fact that he himself is a half-son of Dracula. And as such, he comes with a lot of vampiric powers that most regular nobility would not have access to, including, but not limited to, a very powerful sword, wooden needles that he would need for vampire hunting, but also something known as a carbuncle, aka a living hand, at least a spirit of some such, that is encased within his left hand, that can feed off of the elements to help him out with magic, or be able to deflect magical projectiles when he is in combat. So he has a lot of tools that he would need necessary to hunt down the nobility, including his own vampiric abilities himself. But I will say this much about just the world of it. The constant examples of advanced technology, from combat suits to laser rifles to rocket ships, they serve as consistent reminders that this story takes place in the very far future, showcasing just how much human society has slipped back into harder times. Like, you will hear about these grand exploits that humankind took under the nobility, creating rocket ships to colonize the solar system and reach out through the stars. You'll see how the capital is like this gleaming beacon of majesty of what humanity could achieve. And yet now it is also crumbling into disrepair for the sheer amount of crime and craziness that is going on there. But then, of course, you have the hard edges of the frontier, where people live their daily lives of farming, fishing, being doctors, taking care of the household. They live very simple lives way out in the frontiers, far away from the capital. And we see how there's such a huge diversity when it comes to social classes here. You have, of course, the nobility, you have the humankind who are living in the capitals and cities, and then you have those out in the frontier who live in simple villages. It's such a whiplash of culture and craziness that's going on, and society as a whole, picturing how it once was a gleaming beacon of majesty that is now crumbling into disrepair. The nobility is on the run because at some point they just decided, you know what? We no longer wish to be immortal, and they started having the slow decline of their species as they are hunted down. Despite the fact that humanity is their main food source, a lot of the vampires here have some of the most classic weaknesses, that being they absolutely hate sunlight, and of course will die to a wooden stake in the heart, or in this case, Dee's silver sword. It's interesting to see how these vampires are all based off of Dracula in a way, with all the vampiric weaknesses of course, being unable to cross moving water, and the previous ones I just mentioned. And yet, we also see how their genius has allowed them to overcome some of these weaknesses. For instance, having a powder that they can use which would cast them out of daylight into what is essentially a false moonlight to protect them from any damage. Not to mention, they also have crazy regenerative powers, but also they reside in castles and fortresses reminiscent of good old England, but at the same time they are very technologically advanced with laser defenses, robotic sentinels, and things like that, as well as heavy-duty scanners and other such instruments of sheer far future tech. It's fascinating to see how all of this works, this mixture. But one of the things that is more common is some of the threats that Dee faces, not just vampires themselves, but other monsters as well, such as werewolves, a multi-headed hydra with Medusa abilities, or even, of course, fellow hunters, who have a disreputable reputation. But more than that, throughout each story that we see here, Dee comes in contact with a female companion who ends up falling in love with Dee in one way or another. But the thing that I believe we can see with Dee is that no matter who falls in love with him, he will always grow attached to them due to his own humanity and willing to help them. And as such, his humanity sometimes can be his greatest weakness, especially because he has such a large heart buried under that hard shell of a hunter. You can see it throughout how he keeps this aloof appearance, but there are moments whenever we see past the vampiric nature that he has a gleaming humanity there. That he desperately wants to guard humanity, despite knowing that he's an outcast, and of course him being the son of Dracula doesn't help either, but he still tries to do good. But those are just my overall thoughts on this, and this is just the first 3 books of the series. There are a lot more to it. Last I checked, there was a total of 29 in total that have been published. I've just read the first 3, but I'm already eager to see more. But with that being said, though, let's move on to random thoughts here, where I do a bit of speculation. So, throughout this first 3 novels, throughout this whole collection, we see Dee having to come to terms with the memory of his father, Dracula. And a lot of people mention that Dracula, or the sacred ancestor, has not been seen in hundreds of years. So that makes me wonder, Is Dracula still around? Is he stumbling around on the earth, hidden in some dark corner, or waiting for his son to find him? But also we see flashbacks of Dee's past, of how he was one of the few successes among hundreds of failures, meaning that children were experimented on to become dampirs, or half vampires. And the concept of that is absolutely frightening, especially since we see some of the results of people who become vampires, and yet they wind up dying within what could be years, months, or even weeks. It's a terrifying prospect to see how far this species, these monstrosities, have gone to not only master genetic engineering, but find a way to prolong their own lifespans, and as well as find a way to beat their eternal enemy of the sunlight. And the fact that they actually created a whole plethora of monsters, from dust devils to Medusa gorgons to even just werewolves or other kinds of creatures out of fantasy and horror. They brought them all in. It's essentially a kind of a middle finger to humanity, saying, hey, you want to wipe us out? You're going to have to fight all these guys along with it. And it's so fascinating to see how some of these vampires can be so human. Two of whom, throughout the first and third books in particular, they actually have a thing where they are attracted to a human female. But of course, a pairing like that never goes well, especially when the first vampire in Book 1, Count Lee, winds up meeting his fate due to his attraction to one of the main female characters that we see here. And then, even in Book 3, we see what is essentially a doomed romance. And to be quite honest with you, it's a sad thing to see. It's fascinating to see these vampires being so human, these nobility, these juggernauts of scientific engineering and creativity and just knowledge, either wanting to let their species die out or wanting to fulfill their own desires out on the frontier. It's interesting, but going back to Dee though, I'm very interested to learn more about his backstory if it will be explained more, but I'm also really curious to see more of his story as he progresses across, because the way this series is built, it's more like a set of travel logs. Dee going from place to place, fighting vampires wherever he can find them. But I'm curious to see how it all will wrap up. Will he eventually come into contact with Dracula? Will he face his father? What will happen when he does? Will his vampiric nature overcome him someday? Has he ever slipped up? Things like that. But beneath it all, would he wind up losing his humanity over time? And I'm very curious to see what will happen next. I've actually picked up the second omnibus containing books 4, 5, and 6 that I do plan to read at some point in the future. But for now, I want to focus on some other reads that I have in my collection. But Vampirehunter D has done something different with the vampire mythos, or at least with the vampire makeup, making it where it's not taking place in modern day or ancient times. It is in fact taking place in the far future, with an evolved humanity. And this is a concept that I've never really seen before. Of course, I've read Warhammer, but that's a completely different thing altogether. And while it does take place 40,000 years into the future, this takes place a mere 12,000. And in some ways, that makes the setting smaller, less grandiose than it is in Warhammer, and it kind of brings it down to earth and keeps things grounded, because despite the fact that we've evolved so much, we have devolved even faster. It's interesting to see that, in a way, how technology and fantasy elements can be mixed into this story, into this series. And I'm kind of curious to see more. Anyways, I think I've ranted enough, so with that being said, let's move on to the final score. But you all know me. If I'm praising it this highly, you know what I'm going to score this one. So overall, I would have to give Vampirehunter D, the first omnibus, a solid 10 out of 10. Mostly because not only is there amazing storytelling, great characterization shown here, a great twist on vampires, but one thing I forgot to mention was that there are actually illustrations boiled throughout this entire collection. And they are beautifully cast in black and white in a great way that kind of represents artwork in a way, While it can be hard at times to discern the certain shapes of figures within the story and within the pages, the illustrations alone are absolutely fantastic, and I do recommend also checking those out whenever you have the chance. They are works of art in their own right. But that being said, Hideyuki Kikuchi, you are a fantastic writer, and I look forward to reading more of your works. And for those of you who have heard of Vampire D, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you know of it through the anime films? Do you know of it through the novel series in general? Or did you hear about it and are only just learning about it now? Regardless, I'm curious to hear your own thoughts, and more than anything, guys, thank you so much for listening. It really means a lot if you stuck around to the end of this video. If you like this video, feel free to leave a like, comment your thoughts on this review down below, or subscribe if you're curious for more content in the future. It really means a lot to me that you're listening to this crazy man's podcast about books. And I really would appreciate hearing your support and what you think. Once again, thank you all for listening. This is Rambling Collector, signing off for now, and I will see you all in the next book review. Whether that be manga, comics, novels, what have you, stay tuned. I promise you will not be disappointed.